Stepfather froze when he saw the bikers, what 217 Hell's Angels did next. The sun was setting over the small town, casting a warm orange glow across the quiet neighborhood. Emily stood at the front door of her house, her heart racing with anticipation. She had invited some old friends over for a small family gathering, but what Mark didn't know was that these friends weren't just any old acquaintances. They were members of the Hell's Angels motorcycle club. It had been years since Emily had seen them, and it felt like the right time to reconnect. Mark, her new husband, had always been a quiet and reserved man. He wasn't used to the big city crowds or the fast-paced life that Emily had once known. Before they had met, Emily had lived a very different life, one filled with excitement, adventure, and more than a little bit of danger. Mark had never understood that side of her. He was more of the homebody type, someone who preferred the quiet life of a small town, a life he was more comfortable with. But Emily, she had always loved the thrill of new experiences, and sometimes she couldn't help but yearn for those old days. She had told Mark little about her past life, thinking it would be better to leave it behind. Their children, Jake and Lily, were also unfamiliar with Emily's old world. Jake, at 15 years old, was rebellious and constantly clashed with Mark, while Lily, only 10, was still too young to understand the tension that hung in the air. The family had always felt a little incomplete, like a puzzle with a few missing pieces. Emily hoped that this family gathering might help them all come together, especially Mark, who had always been somewhat distant and unsure of how to fit in with Emily's past. The sound of roaring motorcycle engines suddenly broke the quiet of the neighborhood. Mark froze. He had been in the kitchen preparing dinner when the first bike revved its engine in the distance. He couldn't place it at first, but as the sound grew louder, his face turned pale. The engines weren't just a few passing motorcycles. They were loud, powerful, and the sound grew in intensity by the second. He could feel his heart race, his palms start to sweat. He recognized the sound, the unmistakable roar of a biker gang. Emily had mentioned a few times that her friends would be arriving on motorcycles, but she hadn't said how many. As Mark stood there, frozen in place, the sound grew louder still, and soon enough, the first of what seemed like an endless parade of bikes appeared down the street. They were coming fast, a cloud of dust rising behind them as the rumble of engines vibrated the windows of the house. Mark's eyes widened as the line of motorcycles stretched further than he could see. The bikers were wearing leather jackets and had tattoos covering their arms, their faces hidden behind dark sunglasses. Their bikes gleamed under the fading sunlight, chrome reflecting the surroundings like an intimidating array of metal beasts. Mark's breath hitched in his chest. He knew exactly who these people were. These weren't just casual motorcyclists. They were members of the infamous Hell's Angels Motorcycle Club, one of the most feared and respected groups in the world. Mark's first instinct was to bolt, just run and hide. But Emily, sensing his hesitation, walked over to him with a soft smile on her face, as though she was entirely calm. She had lived through this before. She had known these people long ago, and to her they were more like family than anything else. She placed her hand gently on Mark's shoulder. "It's okay," she said. "They're here for the family gathering. They're good people, trust me." Mark didn't know what to say. His mind was spinning. He had heard the rumors, the stories about the Hell's Angels. He knew they had a reputation, a dangerous one at that. He knew that people feared them, and for good reason. The Hell's Angels weren't just any motorcycle club. They were a brotherhood, a tight-knit group that lived by their own rules, one that struck fear into the hearts of most people. The media painted them as lawless outlaws, people who could never be trusted, who were always looking for a fight. Mark's chest tightened and his throat went dry. He looked over at Emily, who seemed to sense his anxiety. "Just be yourself," she said softly. "I'll be with you the whole time. They're here to reconnect, not to cause trouble." Mark swallowed hard, nodding, though he wasn't sure if he believed her. He tried to remind himself that Emily knew these people, but the fear in his gut remained. As the bikers pulled up in front of the house, their engines roaring to a stop, Mark could feel his heart pounding in his ears. His eyes scanned the line of bikes, and he noticed that there were more than he had first thought, at least 30 bikes, maybe more. The riders began to dismount, their heavy boots thudding against the pavement. Each biker seemed larger than life, their presence imposing, their leather jackets adorned with patches and symbols that made Mark feel small and out of place. Then, to his surprise, the riders began to approach the house. One by one, they walked up the driveway, shaking hands with Emily as if they were old friends. Mark's stomach churned. His mind raced with questions. Who were these people? Why had they come? Was this a joke? Or was it something more? As the first few bikers reached him, Mark stiffened. He hadn't been expecting this. They were bigger than he had imagined, towering over him, their eyes hidden behind sunglasses, their expressions unreadable. "Hey there, Mark," a voice boomed from behind him. Mark turned to see one of the bikers, a large man with a thick beard and a patch on his chest that read Jack, extending a hand. His grip was firm, and Mark hesitated before shaking it. "You must be the new guy," Jack said with a grin. "I'm Jack. We've heard a lot about you." The way Jack said it was surprisingly warm, but Mark could still sense the weight of his presence. Mark tried to smile, but it felt stiff. Yeah, I'm Mark," he stammered. "Nice to meet you." He could feel his hands shaking, but he did his best to mask it. Jack gave him a knowing look. "Don't worry, we're not here to cause any trouble," he said. "Just here to reconnect with old friends, have a good time." He motioned to the others, who were now milling around the yard, chatting with Emily and the kids. "This is just a get-together, man. No need to be nervous." As the minutes passed, Mark began to feel a little less tense. He watched as the bikers interacted with Emily's children, Jake and Lily. To his surprise, they weren't intimidating or threatening at all. Jake, who usually had a rebellious streak and avoided talking to adults, seemed to be completely captivated by the bikers, asking questions about their bikes and their experiences. Lily, with her bright eyes and endless curiosity, was talking to one of the women bikers, who was telling her stories about the road. The tension in Mark's shoulders slowly began to fade, though his mind still raced. There was no denying the weight of the bikers' presence, but as Emily had said, they seemed harmless, at least for now. Emily caught Mark's eye from across the yard and smiled. She walked over to him, her arms open for a hug. "See, nothing to worry about," she said softly. Mark took a deep breath, looking around at the scene. The bikers were laughing and talking with the family, sharing stories, and for the first time he could see that they weren't just the dangerous criminals he had imagined. They were people with lives, stories, and families of their own. Mark smiled back at Emily, though he still had his doubts. This was going to be a long evening. As Mark stood there, trying to push away the remaining nerves that were tingling in his hands, he realized that something remarkable was happening. The noise of the bikes had faded, and in its place was a strange but welcoming silence. The bikers had begun to talk amongst themselves, many of them introducing themselves to Emily's children and engaging in friendly conversation. The tension in Mark's chest began to loosen, though he still felt like a stranger in this unusual gathering. Jake, who had been avoiding family gatherings ever since Mark had moved in, was now deep in conversation with a biker named Alex. Alex was tall, with a scruffy beard and a pair of aviator sunglasses that seemed permanently glued to his face. He had a certain confidence about him, but it wasn't the kind of confidence that made Mark feel intimidated. Instead, Alex's demeanor seemed relaxed, as though he were just another guy talking to a teenager about something they both found interesting: motorcycles. Jake, who had always loved anything with an engine, asked questions about the bikes, clearly impressed by the way Alex talked about them with such passion. Emily was right. They weren't here to cause trouble. Mark couldn't help but watch as the bikers shared their stories, laughing loudly and clapping each other on the back. He found himself caught off guard by the contrast between the rough, intimidating appearance of the group and the warmth they were showing. At first, he thought it was all some kind of elaborate act, but as the minutes ticked by, he started to see that these were real people with real lives, not the criminal gang he had imagined. Lily, who had been a little shy at first, was now chatting away with another biker, a woman named Carla. Carla was in her late 30s, with a kind face and an easy smile that put Lily at ease right away. She talked to Lily about her own experiences with her family, explaining how important it was to find joy in the little things. Mark could see Lily's face light up as Carla shared her stories, laughing along as they talked about their favorite books and movies. Mark was amazed at how quickly the bikers had connected with his kids. The tension he had been holding onto for so long slowly started to dissipate, and for the first time since the bikers had arrived, Mark felt like he could breathe. Despite the sudden change in atmosphere, Mark couldn't ignore the nagging thought that still lingered in the back of his mind. He had grown up hearing stories about the Hells Angels, and their reputation for being ruthless and dangerous. He had been told that they operated outside the law, living on the edge of society. He remembered hearing news reports about gang violence, about crimes that were somehow linked to their name, though he had never seen it firsthand. He had always assumed that people like him, the quiet, everyday folks, didn't stand a chance against a group like this. Yet here he was, surrounded by people who seemed, well, normal. They weren't what he had expected. In fact, they seemed like they could be anyone, neighbors, friends, coworkers. They laughed, they joked, they shared stories about their lives, and most of all, they respected Emily and her family. Mark's perception of them was slowly shifting, but it wasn't an easy change to make. His fear still clung to him, like a shadow he couldn't shake. Jack, the biker who had greeted Mark earlier, approached him again. This time he held out a bottle of cold beer, offering it to Mark with a friendly grin. "You look like you could use one of these," Jack said, his voice calm and easygoing. Mark hesitated for a moment, glancing over at Emily. She nodded slightly, as if to say it was okay. Mark had never been one for alcohol, but he couldn't help but feel that this was part of the process, letting go of the fear and seeing the people in front of him for who they really were. He took the beer, thanking Jack with a nervous smile. "So, Mark, what do you do for a living?" Jack asked, settling down on a nearby lawn chair. Mark sat beside him, still trying to shake off his unease. This was supposed to be a normal conversation, right? But he still couldn't completely let go of his anxiety. "I work in construction," Mark replied, taking a sip from the beer. "I've been in the business for a while, mostly managing small projects." He didn't know why he had said it like that. It was probably the simplest way to explain his work, but it felt like such a contrast to the people sitting around him. Here were people who had lived through things he could only imagine, and yet they were sitting here having a casual conversation with him. Jack nodded, listening attentively. "Construction, huh? That's good work. Hard, but good. I've done a bit of that in my time, too," he said. "It's about building things that last, right? Kind of like what we do, but with our own kind of tools and skills." Mark raised an eyebrow, unsure of where Jack was going with that. "I guess so," he said cautiously. Jack smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "We all build things, Mark. It's just a matter of how you approach it. Some of us build things that can be touched and seen, like your houses or roads, but some of us, well, we build something a little different. We build connections. We build brotherhood. And that's just as important as anything else." Mark was taken aback by this statement. He had expected the typical biker bravado, the kind of live fast, die young attitude he had always imagined these people to have. But instead, Jack had just spoken about something far deeper: connection. Mark thought about it for a moment. The Hells Angels, despite all their tough exteriors, clearly valued loyalty, respect, and unity. These weren't just random people in leather jackets. They were a family, a group that took care of its own. As the conversation continued, Mark began to realize that this wasn't just some wild, chaotic gathering. It was a reunion. These bikers, with their hard-worn faces and tattoos, had come together not to wreak havoc, but to reconnect with old friends, to share stories, and to enjoy a simple evening together. For the first time since they had arrived, Mark felt himself relax. He wasn't ready to completely drop his guard, but he could sense that these people weren't here to harm him or his family. The evening wore on, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere grew even more relaxed. The bikers helped Emily with the dinner preparations, offering to pitch in with whatever they could. They didn't act like they were above it all, like they were too tough to help. They joked with Emily, telling her how they'd never forget her hospitality when they were younger, and how much they admired the way she had built a life for herself and her family. Mark watched this unfold, still amazed by the transformation that had taken place in such a short time. The bikers weren't just an intimidating presence. They were real people, with emotions, histories, and lives that extended far beyond their motorcycles and leather jackets. They weren't just a club. They were individuals who cared about their friends and families, just like Mark did. As the night continued, the last of the bikers gathered their things to leave. They said their goodbyes, and each one offered Mark a handshake, a smile, or a pat on the back. To Mark's surprise, they were all genuinely kind, each one expressing their gratitude for the evening. The sound of the bikes revving up again filled the air, but this time, it didn't send Mark's heart into his throat. Instead, he stood there, watching as they rode off into the distance, realizing that what he had feared the most had turned out to be nothing more than a false assumption. Mark turned to Emily, who was watching him with a knowing smile. "You were right," he said quietly. "They're not what I thought," Emily smiled, squeezing his hand. "I'm glad you see that." The next few days felt different for Mark. His mind kept returning to the gathering, the warm laughter of the bikers, and their stories that painted a picture of a world he hadn't seen before. At first, he couldn't shake the image of the rough leather jackets and tattoos, but now they seemed less intimidating and more like symbols of the lives they had lived. Lives that were complicated, full of stories, and yet, just like his own, filled with moments of love, loyalty, and family. Mark had always been a bit of an introvert, preferring the quiet hum of his work and his small routine. His life before meeting Emily had been predictable. He had grown up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else, where the loudest thing in the evening air was the chirping of crickets. It was a safe, peaceful existence, and he liked it that way. Emily's world, on the other hand, was something entirely different. She had lived in cities, traveled far, and had stories that, when she shared them, seemed like something out of a different world. He had always admired her for her openness, but he had never been ready to embrace that world fully. Over the next few days, Mark found himself thinking about that gathering more and more. He wasn't sure why it had stayed with him so strongly. It wasn't like he was going to hang out with the Hell's Angels every weekend. But something about the way they treated each other, the way they interacted with Emily and the kids, stayed with him. Maybe it was the sense of camaraderie, the bond they shared. Mark realized that he had never really experienced something like that, where people, despite their rough exteriors, took care of one another in a way that was almost unspoken. Emily, ever the perceptive one, noticed the change in him. "You've been quiet the past few days," she said one evening as they sat down for dinner. She was stirring a pot of soup, the smell of herbs and spices filling the kitchen. "Thinking about the bikers?" she asked, a playful smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Mark nodded slowly, unsure of how to explain what he was feeling. "I don't know, Em," he said, looking down at his plate. "I can't stop thinking about how normal they were, not at all what I expected." He paused, considering his words carefully. "They're not what people make them out to be." Emily set the spoon down and leaned back against the counter, watching him closely. "I told you, Mark, people are complicated. The ones you think are the toughest might have the biggest hearts." Mark let out a breath, feeling a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying begin to lift. "I guess I've always thought they were just a gang, like they only cared about the motorcycle club, but they didn't act like that. They actually seemed like they cared about you and about the kids." Emily smiled softly, but there was a touch of sadness in her eyes. "Yeah, they do care, and I've known them for a long time. Back when I was younger, we all went through a lot together. It wasn't always easy, but we had each other's backs, and I've always thought that was something special." Mark's thoughts drifted back to the day of the gathering. The laughter, the easy conversations, the way they had all made an effort to get to know Jake and Lily. It had been so different from what he expected. One of the bikers, a man named Rick, had spent a long time talking to Lily about her love of art. He was the last person Mark would have pegged as an art enthusiast. But there he was, discussing colors, techniques, and how important it was to express yourself through creativity. It was a side of the Hell's Angels that Mark had never considered. These were people who valued more than just their image. That evening, as Emily continued to prepare dinner, Mark found himself more at ease. The awkwardness that had lingered since the gathering had slowly begun to fade. He still couldn't shake his initial fear of them, but now it seemed less like a fear and more like a misunderstanding. The next day, Jake came to him with something he hadn't expected. Jake, who had always been distant, more interested in his friends than in family activities, seemed almost excited. "Dad," Jake said, his voice hesitant but eager, "I was thinking about going to see Alex again." Alex was one of the bikers Jake had talked to during the gathering. "He said I could come by and check out his bike. I'd really like to learn more about how it works." Mark blinked in surprise. "You want to spend more time with him?" he asked, trying to make sense of this sudden interest. Jake nodded, his face serious. "Yeah, I mean, he knows a lot about motorcycles and he's cool. I thought I could learn some stuff. Plus, he said I could ride with him if I ever get my license. I don't know, Dad. He's not like other adults. He's different." Mark smiled, though he still wasn't entirely sure what to make of it. He had expected his son to be more cautious, to reject the idea of getting too close to the bikers. But here Jake was, eager to learn, eager to connect. The bikers had done something Mark hadn't anticipated. They had bridged the gap between him and his son, even if it was in a way that he hadn't expected. "All right, Jake," Mark said, his voice steady. "You can go. Just make sure you stay safe and let me know where you are." Jake grinned and left the room, already texting Alex about the visit. Mark watched him go, his thoughts swirling. What had just happened? Was it really that easy to connect with someone, even with someone so different from himself? It wasn't just the bikers, personalities that had shifted his perspective. It was the way they had treated his family, especially Jake, who had always been so resistant to anything that wasn't his idea. Later that evening, after Jake had returned from his visit, Mark asked him how it went. Jake was practically glowing as he talked about the ride, the bike, and everything Alex had taught him about motorcycle mechanics. "He showed me how to change the oil and fix a flat tire," Jake said, his eyes wide with excitement. "I never thought I'd learn something like that." Mark couldn't help but laugh. "Well, it sounds like you had a good time." "I did," Jake admitted, "and Alex. He's just, I don't know, he's different. He actually listens, you know?" Mark's heart warmed. This wasn't just about motorcycles anymore. This was about Jake finding someone who understood him in a way Mark hadn't been able to, someone who made him feel like he belonged. The following weekend, Emily invited some of the bikers back for another visit. This time, Mark wasn't nervous. He wasn't trying to put on a brave face or hide his uncertainty. Instead, he looked forward to seeing them again. As the familiar rumble of motorcycle engines grew louder outside, Mark smiled to himself. Maybe this time it wouldn't be so strange. Maybe it would feel like they were just family. The bikers arrived just as they had before, but this time it felt different. The fear Mark had once felt was replaced with a kind of curiosity. These people, these bikers, were no longer just a distant, intimidating group. They were now part of his life, even if only for a short time. And that was something Mark hadn't expected. In a way, they had shown him that appearances could be deceiving, and that the people we fear might just be the ones who teach us the most about ourselves. As the evening unfolded, Mark joined the conversation with the bikers. He didn't try to impress anyone, didn't worry about saying the wrong thing. He just listened. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than just his own little world. A world that now included people who, despite their rough exteriors, had shown him what it meant to be truly connected. To family, to friends, and to life. It had been a week since the bikers had come for the gathering, and Mark still found himself reflecting on the experience. The initial fear he had felt had faded, but there were still lingering thoughts about the complexity of the people he had met. As time passed, Mark's perception of the Hells Angels continued to evolve. They weren't just bikers or tough-looking individuals. They were real people with their own struggles, dreams, and values. One evening, as Mark sat on the porch with Emily, a thought began to form in his mind. He had never really thought about the deeper aspects of what the bikers had shared during their visit. Sure, they had told funny stories, had talked about their adventures on the road, but there was something more, something beneath the surface that Mark hadn't fully grasped at the time. The bond they shared with one another was unlike anything Mark had seen before. It wasn't just about riding bikes or living a certain lifestyle. It was about loyalty, trust, and respect. It was about belonging to something bigger than yourself, something that gave you purpose. Emily sat beside him, sipping her tea, her eyes soft as she watched the sun dip below the horizon. "You've been quiet tonight," she said, her voice gentle. "What's on your mind?" Mark leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping gently on the armrest. "I've been thinking about them," he said, his voice thoughtful. "The bikers, I mean, it's not what I expected at all." Emily raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Mark paused for a moment, searching for the right words. "They're different from what I thought," he said. "I mean, I always thought they were just violent, reckless people, but they're not like that at all. They have this way of taking care of each other. They really care about their families and their friends." Emily smiled softly, her eyes glinting with something like pride. "I'm glad you see that," she said. "People aren't always what they seem on the surface. You know, when I first met them, they weren't the toughest bunch either. They were young, just trying to figure out life, but they stuck together. They had each other's backs when no one else did." Mark nodded, his thoughts drifting back to the conversations he had heard at the gathering. One of the bikers, a man named Gary, had shared a story that stuck with Mark. Gary had talked about a time when the club had helped one of their own, a member who had fallen on hard times. The group didn't just help him financially, they helped him rebuild his life, gave him a place to stay, and treated him like family. It was something that stuck with Mark because it wasn't just a gesture of charity. It was a commitment to each other's well-being. It was a commitment that went beyond words. Gary was right, Mark said slowly, more to himself than to Emily. They're not just a group of bikers, they're a family, and they look out for each other. Emily's smile widened, and she gently placed a hand on Mark's. That's exactly it. They're a family. They might not look like the families we're used to seeing, but they're just as real, just as important. Mark leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. The idea of family had always been important to him, but in a different way. His own family had been small, close-knit, but there was always a sense of distance between him and his parents. His upbringing had been quiet and predictable, but perhaps too much so. He had never known what it was like to belong to something bigger, something that wasn't just about blood ties. The bikers had shown him that family could be more than just biology. It could be a shared bond, a commitment to stand by each other no matter what. As Mark reflected on this, he began to understand something else. He realized that, in a way, he had been missing out on a deeper connection with the people around him. Emily, the kids, and even the bikers, they all had something that he had lacked for most of his life. He had always been a loner, a man who kept to himself. But seeing the way the bikers had come together, the way they supported one another, made Mark realize how important it was to open himself up to those kinds of connections. A few days later, Jake came home from another visit with Alex, the biker who had become something of a mentor to him. When Jake walked in, he was practically glowing, his face lit up with excitement. Mark had been expecting Jake to be eager about the visit, but seeing him like this, it was clear that something had changed. Jake was no longer just fascinated by motorcycles. He was learning from someone who had become a role model in his life. "Dad, you won't believe what Alex showed me today," Jake said as he walked into the living room. "He's teaching me how to fix engines, and today we worked on the carburetor. I never thought I'd be able to do something like that. It's amazing." Mark smiled, proud of Jake for taking an interest in something that was both educational and practical. But there was more to it than that. Mark could see how much this new connection meant to Jake. It wasn't just about learning how to fix a bike. It was about having someone who believed in him, someone who was willing to invest time and energy into his future. "I'm glad you're enjoying it," Mark said, his voice warm. "But just remember, Jake, you need to stay focused on school too. You can't forget about your studies." Jake nodded, his enthusiasm unshaken. "I won't, Dad. Alex said that knowledge is everything. He said if you don't keep learning, you'll miss out on opportunities. He's right." Mark was taken aback by how mature Jake sounded. It was as if he had grown up overnight, influenced by someone who cared enough to teach him more than just how to ride a bike. Mark realized that Alex wasn't just teaching Jake mechanical skills. He was teaching him life lessons, lessons that Mark hadn't even considered. The next day, Mark found himself at work, his mind drifting back to the bikers. He was thinking about how they had helped Jake and how they had changed his own outlook on family and connection. As he worked through his usual tasks, Mark noticed something, a shift in the way he viewed the world. He had always believed that life was about routine, about getting by. But now, he saw that it was about more than that. It was about building relationships, about understanding and supporting each other. Later that evening, as Mark and Emily sat together in the living room, Mark spoke up. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I think I'm starting to get it, about what you said about family." Emily turned to him, her eyes soft with understanding. "What do you mean?" Mark paused for a moment before answering. "I mean that it's not just about who you're related to. It's about who you choose to be with, who you stand by. The bikers, they've shown me that. It's about loyalty, trust, and respect. It's not just about blood. It's about the bond you create with the people who matter." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I'm glad you see that. Sometimes it takes meeting the right people to make you realize what really matters." Mark nodded, his gaze fixed on the window as the evening sky darkened. He wasn't just thinking about the bikers anymore. He was thinking about his own life, about the choices he had made and the relationships he had formed. He had been so focused on his own small world that he hadn't fully understood the importance of the people around him. But now, with Emily by his side, with Jake and Lily learning and growing, and with the bikers' unexpected friendship, Mark felt a sense of peace. He knew that life wasn't just about surviving, it was about connecting, about building something meaningful with the people who truly mattered. As the days passed, Mark's understanding of family continued to deepen. He wasn't just part of a family by blood. He was part of a larger, more complex family, one that extended beyond his immediate circle. It was a family that was built on respect, trust, and the willingness to help one another. And as Mark sat back and watched his family grow closer, he knew that he had learned something that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The weeks after the bikers' visit felt like a new chapter for Mark and his family. Mark had always prided himself on being a steady, reliable man. But the experiences with the Hells Angels had shown him that there was more to life than just staying in his comfort zone. For the first time, Mark felt a true sense of belonging, not just within his own small family, but within a broader community. He had always assumed that a family was something that could only be defined by blood, but he had learned from Emily and the bikers that family was something much deeper than that. It was about loyalty, respect, and the willingness to stand by each other through thick and thin. Jake and Lily had both grown in their own ways, too. Jake's interest in motorcycles and mechanics had deepened, and he spent more time with Alex, learning not just about bikes but also about life. The way Alex spoke about challenges, about overcoming obstacles and standing up for what you believed in, had started to resonate with Jake in a way that Mark had never been able to reach. The bond between them had grown stronger, and Mark couldn't deny how grateful he was for that connection. Lily, who had always been more reserved, had also started to come out of her shell. Her curiosity about the bikers and their stories had sparked a new sense of wonder in her. Carla, one of the women from the gang, had become a kind of mentor to Lily, taking her on small adventures around the neighborhood, teaching her how to ride a bicycle properly and how to fix minor issues with it. It was a simple thing, but it had made a big difference in Lily's confidence. As for Emily and Mark, their relationship had deepened. Emily had always been the more open and adventurous one, while Mark had tended to stay on the sidelines. But through his interactions with the bikers and his growing understanding of what it meant to truly connect with others, Mark had started to open up more, both to Emily and to the people around him. He wasn't as closed off as he had been before. He had learned to share his thoughts and feelings, something he had never been good at doing. Their evenings spent talking on the porch, reflecting on the changes in their lives, had become more meaningful. Emily had always known that Mark was capable of more, but now she saw him begin to realize it for himself. One day, as Mark sat in the living room, he heard the unmistakable sound of motorcycles in the distance. This time, he didn't flinch or freeze up like he had the first time. Instead, he smiled to himself, thinking about how far he had come. Emily, who was in the kitchen, glanced out the window and noticed the familiar bikes approaching. "They're back," Emily said, a hint of amusement in her voice. Mark nodded, standing up from his seat. "I'm actually looking forward to seeing them again," he said with a genuine smile. It was the first time he had said that without hesitation. When the bikers arrived, it was like a reunion. Jake and Lily were already outside, waiting eagerly for their friends. Mark stood on the porch, watching as Alex, Carla, and the others dismounted from their bikes, laughing and chatting among themselves. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost as if they had all known each other for years. The nervousness Mark had once felt was gone. In its place was a sense of belonging, a feeling that had settled in his chest like a long-lost part of him finally being found. Alex walked up to Mark with a grin. "Hey, man, how's it going?" he asked, giving him a firm handshake. "It's going well," Mark replied, feeling the warmth of the greeting. "You?" "Same here," Alex said. "Jake's been telling me all about the bike repair stuff he's learning. He's got a good head on his shoulders." Mark couldn't help but feel proud. "Yeah, he's really taking to it." "I didn't expect it, honestly. He's been focused more than I've ever seen him." Alex chuckled. "That's the thing about bikes. They teach you more than just mechanics. They teach you patience, responsibility, a lot of stuff." Mark nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude. Alex wasn't just talking about bikes. He was talking about life. Mark realized that, in a way, the bikers had taught him something similar. They had taught him the value of connection, of taking the time to truly understand the people around you. Carla, noticing the two men talking, joined them with a warm smile. "It's good to see you again, Mark," she said, her voice friendly. "Lily has been asking me about how to do some more bike repairs. I told her she's welcome to come by any time if she wants to learn." Mark smiled, his heart swelling with appreciation. "Thank you, Carla. She really looks up to you." Carla shrugged with a grin. "It's easy to inspire someone who's willing to listen, and Lily's got a curious mind. She's going to do great things." Mark's thoughts were interrupted by Jake, who came running over with a huge grin on his face. "Dad, guess what?" he asked breathlessly. "Alex said I can join him and the others for a weekend trip to the mountains. I'll be learning more about bike maintenance and we'll camp out." "It's going to be awesome." Mark felt a rush of pride, but also a hint of worry. He had never been the type to let Jake venture out too far on his own, especially with people he had only recently come to know. But something in his gut told him that this was different. Jake wasn't just going for a trip. He was going to learn, to grow, and to experience something that Mark had never had the opportunity to do at that age. "You sure you're ready for that?" Mark asked, trying to hide his hesitation. Jake nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah. I think it's going to be great. I'll be with Alex and the others. They know what they're doing, and they've got my back." Mark thought about it for a moment. He could hear the sincerity in Jake's voice, and he knew that this was an important opportunity for his son. "All right, Jake," he said, his voice steady. "I trust you. Just make sure to keep in touch and be safe." Jake's eyes lit up, and he gave Mark a quick hug before running off to join the others. Emily stood next to Mark, watching their son run off with the bikers. "I'm proud of him," she said quietly. "He's growing up so fast." Mark smiled, his heart full. "I am too, Em. He's come a long way." As the evening wore on, Mark found himself feeling at peace in a way he hadn't experienced before. The bikers had become more than just a group of intimidating outsiders. They had become part of his extended family, a family that was built not on blood, but on respect, trust, and shared experiences. They had shown him that it was possible to have a sense of belonging with people who were different from you, people who came from a different world, but shared the same fundamental values. As the bikers said their goodbyes and revved their engines to head home, Mark stood on the porch, watching them ride off into the night. He realized that he had changed in ways he hadn't expected. He had learned that there was more to life than just staying within the safety of his own boundaries. Sometimes, to truly live, you had to step outside of your comfort zone and open yourself up to new experiences, new connections, and new possibilities. He turned to Emily, who stood beside him, a knowing smile on her face. "You were right," he said softly. "Family isn't just about who you're related to, it's about who you choose to be with, who you stand by, and I'm grateful for them, for all of us." Emily took his hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm glad you see that, Mark." As the night drew to a close, Mark felt a deep sense of contentment. He had found a new understanding of family, one that wasn't defined by conventional expectations, but by something far stronger: connection. And as the stars twinkled above, he knew that, no matter what came next, he had the people who mattered most by his side.